Hi everyone. This is my first attempt at trying to do a video recording of myself to answer your questions from the Ask Me Anything post. So starting with Imani's question, I am curious how we should go about checking our grades from discussion posts. So those grades will be posted onto the gradebook in Canvas in a couple of weeks after I've graded your midterm papers, which will be, the assignment will be getting posted next week, early next week. And those will be a temporary grade, telling you sort of how you're doing with the discussion posts up to this point in the semester. But I wouldn't worry. Everyone seems to be doing pretty well with the discussion posts. Everybody is posting on all of the questions. You're all responding to each other. So I wouldn't worry about your grade for discussion posts because everybody seems to be doing pretty well right now. Vishnu asked, the readings this week describe the 1980s as a period of backlash against the second wave feminist movement. Do you believe we are entering another backlash period today with legal challenges to Roe v. Wade and increased anti-abortion sentiments on the federal level? I think there's always existed backlash. Like the 1980s gets sort of this focus because it's such a huge shift that happened in talking about feminism and declaring it dead. But I think as we see throughout all like the different time periods of feminism that we've discussed, there've always been some backlash. There've always been some resistance. There've always been groups of people who have challenged feminist politics. And I think that certainly that's the case right now. I think we are definitely in the midst of a very, very conservative political climate. And a lot of focus on getting rid of things like abortion rights. But I don't see it sort of as a backlash. I see it as something that's persistently there, particularly when dealing with the issues of abortion rights. It's always a very controversial issue. It's always been a controversial issue. So I think there's always going to be resistance to that particular issue, no matter what time period we're in. Let's see. Raneem has a series of questions. First one, when did you realize you wanted to go into women's studies? Have you ever regretted it? Actually, I didn't go into women's studies. My PhD is actually in ethnic studies. And within ethnic studies, my research and my teaching focuses on the experiences of women of color. So I always focus on both race and gender and sort of the intersections of race and gender and the experiences of women of color. Right now, I'm in a women's studies department because this happens to be a department that values intersectionality and values diversity in its curriculum and so on. And so it's been a great space for me to be able to pursue both my interests around race and gender. So I have not regretted it at all. I think this is the second women's studies department that I've worked with in my career. And they've always been positive experiences for me. They've always been great teaching experiences for me to teach women's studies students. So no regrets in working with women's studies so far, and hopefully it'll stay that way. I'm really enjoying this course, but sometimes when I'm doing the readings, I get very sad. It's making me extra hyper aware of my position as a woman, and sometimes I wake up and I just don't want to think about it anymore. How do you deal with knowing that being a woman comes with a great deal of oppression? I hear you. I mean, it's very hard to be a scholar who does teaching and research on race and gender. And so it is very hard. There are some days where it's really hard to prepare for class, right? I have the flip side of what you have. And it can be really difficult and emotionally draining. But I think what keeps me going is to know this history, to know that there are women who, even in much more dire circumstances with a lot less access to resources and so on, and different kinds of political climates, have been able to rise up and fight back and find their voice and speak their truth. And I think keeping that into perspective and the fact that those women have always existed and still exist today, I think makes it better for me to be able to deal with those days when it's kind of hard to deal with the realities of the world. Another question, this is also from Raneem. When you see women who are anti-abortion, like the women from the last week who were against women's rights and wanted to stay at home, how do you balance being supportive of all women and not feeling betrayed by them? It makes me really angry and frustrated when I see other women putting women down and delaying our cause. I agree with you. It makes me very angry to see women, to see people of color, to see sometimes queer people who vote against their own interests, who will support politics that you're like, why are you supporting this? Do you realize that this is hurtful to you? It is very frustrating. But I don't think that we need to be supportive of all women. I think that it's important to, I think the way that feminism has shifted now, it went from sort of this shift of the second wave with the whole idea of sisterhood, that we have to be supportive of all women, to realizing that feminism isn't about the individual's identities, it's about the politics that it upholds. And so for me, feminism is about upholding a critique of patriarchy, of thinking about how to dismantle sexism, and to do it in an intersectional way that is mindful of the ways that all these different issues affect different types of women in multiple ways. And so I support women who support that, right? I don't think that I have to support conservative women, or, women who I don't agree with politically, or that I feel that are kind of, supporting things that are against what I feel strongly are my best interests, as a woman and as a woman of color. What I do think I owe other women is giving them the benefit of the doubt, trying to understand where they're coming from. Like, what is this really about, right? And trying to be understanding, and hope that approach leads to potential dialogue. But if it doesn't, as we're seeing, with This Bridge Called My Back, in those pieces, you have to kind of know when to walk away from people who just refuse to listen, for your own self-care needs. And I think that that's what we need to be able to do. Let's see. I think this is the last question. J.K. Rowling's recent remarks regarding transgenders made me furious, as I'm a very passionate Harry Potter fan. But when I brought it up with my best friend, who was a very hardcore radical feminist, she gave me a different perspective that I'm still trying to understand. Her argument was that trans women do not face what cis women face from a young age, that being born with a vagina is associated with different experiences to being born biologically male. She argues that a total inclusion of trans women in the feminist movement is not truly feminist. What are your opinions on this matter? I'm aware that trans women face many challenges, but are they the same, similar to those of women? I think the response to this question is a both and type of answer, and we will be reading in a few weeks about trans identities and trans authors who talk about femininity being something that trans and cis women have in common and have to navigate in common, and how femininity itself is has negative things portrayed or attached to it. As some of you discussed on the topic of girly feminism, right? That, there's all these negativity surrounding femininity as, meaning weak or less than, and so on. And so that girly feminism is reclaiming those things to sort of counter those narratives around femininity as being something that's weak or undervalued. And so trans women would argue that that's something that they also have to, deal with. So I think that there are things that are similar, but I think that there are things that are different and unique and distinct to each experience. I think, as your friend said, there is a difference between sort of growing up biologically female and all the things that are attached to that from a very early age, wear pink, play with dolls, and so on. And how, little girls are sexualized and all these negative things and that happen to little girls, unfortunately, that don't necessarily happen in the same way to biologically male boys, right? There's certain things attached to them as well, right? Only play with trucks, only wear blue, and so on. But that there's a difference in sort of what's put upon each body, so to speak, depending on the biology. But at the same time, there's, you know, some distinct things that those two children would experience, right? If the boy feels like internally he is really a girl, then that child is experiencing something very particular that the cisgender little girl is not, right? If her biology and her identity like all mesh well together and support each other in her mind, then she at least does not have that conflict that, you know, that a trans little boy might feel, thinking about, well, what's wrong with me? Why do I like girl things? And why do I like girly things, for example, right? So I think that the answer is really that there are overlaps between cis and gender and trans women, and there are things that are unique and distinct to each one. But I think in terms of feminism, I think we have to think about, you know, what kind of a feminism we want to build, right? And do we want a kind of feminism where womanhood is only ascribed to women who have vaginas? You know, is it only ascribed to women who can bear children? I mean, there are a lot of women who have vaginas that cannot bear children. So I think there's a danger in defining womanhood as only being a certain way, because it creates limits, right? And I think what we've seen throughout the whole history of feminism is that one core thing about all types of feminism is to challenge the limitations that have been imposed on women, right? And so I think if that's one of our core values as feminists, then we should be embracing and open to all kinds of broad and different ways of defining what womanhood means, right? That could be potentially liberating, not just for trans women, but for all women. So I think that it's very unfortunate that J.K. Rowling has made the comments that she's made. I too am a Harry Potter fan, but I am hopeful. Like I said, you know, I don't have to support all women, but I think it is my responsibility to at least try to be understanding of where they might be coming from. And I try to think about that when it comes to J.K. Rowling as well, as like what is the underlying fear that's there? Because I think that that's what's really happening there. Like, what is it that you're afraid of losing by including trans women into your feminism? And from my experience of what I've observed is that many of the women who make similar kinds of comments about trans women and their place in feminism happen to be from that second wave generation. And I think part of what that generation is dealing with is the difficulties of letting go of what they've known feminism to mean their entire lives, right? And I think that can be challenging, right? And so I think that that's part of the challenge that women like J.K. Rowling are dealing with. And so what I'm hopeful for is that she will learn, right? That she will learn based on the response that she's gotten, that she's hopefully listening to her fan base that have expressed feeling offended and feeling hurt by her comments, and that it will create an opening for her to be able to become curious instead of judgmental and want to learn more and reach a point where she rethinks her perspective. So that's sort of my hope about all of this that you mentioned. But hold on to these questions, because I think especially the questions around trans experiences is something that we'll definitely be getting more into in a couple of weeks. And I would be curious to see how those readings and those discussions contribute to your thinking and your questioning, basically, of trans experiences. So that is, I believe, the end of all the questions that I got. Thank you all for submitting questions. And hopefully this is informative and educational for you, and hopefully I've answered your questions. If I haven't, please shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation via email if you'd like. Otherwise, that's it for me for this session of Ask Me Anything. See you guys online.